I would like to introduce Bertrand de LaChapelle. Bertrand is joining us from Paris, where they probably have a lot less snow. And he will be giving us an overview of a project he is working on about cross-border internet and national jurisdictions. Bertrand de LaChapelle is Program Director at the International Diplomatic Academy and a Director on the Board of Directors for the Internet Corporation for Assigned Names and Numbers, ICANN. From 2006 to 2010, he was France's thematic ambassador and special envoy for the Information Society. Ça nous fait plaisir, Bertrand. Bon, bienvenue.
Merci beaucoup. Thank you so much. It's an extreme pleasure to be here today. I mean, it's an amazing crowd. I'm very thankful to CIRA for the invitation. I'm amazed at how this little thing that a few of us were conspiring and setting up a few years ago called the Internet Governance Forum is now self-replicating. I don't know if it's a virus or a positive spread, but it's amazing. I've seen that emerging in many countries, and I think it is a testimony to the self-organizing nature of everything that has to do with the internet. So congrats to the organizers, and thank you so much for giving me the opportunity to talk today. What I would like to say is that normally I am known for making statements, making presentations, providing solutions, often a bit earlier than the moment where things are ripe. Today I would like to do something different and actually ask questions. And I would like to raise 3 questions related to this program that I'm directing at the International Diplomatic Academy called Internet and Jurisdiction. And those 3 questions are as follows. The first one is somewhat related to something that was discussed a bit earlier in the previous panel, which is the internet becoming victim of its own success? The second question is, when we're talking about governance and international regulatory frameworks, is the traditional system that we're using, nation states, the so-called Westphalian system, is it reaching its limit? Is it having a sort of scaling problem? And the third question, which is a bit provocative even more, is, are we witnessing the emergence of a new geography for cyberspace? And all that in 10 minutes. So very quickly on the first question, is the internet victim of its own success? I don't have to repeat what has been said before regarding the growth, the success of the internet. We're talking about the 2 billions, but we should also be talking about the 6 billion people who are with mobile phones. Of course, they are not all connected to the internet, but there will be. And so the internet has moved from the internet to the World Wide Web to what I would call today easily a social net, which is a third layer. It's a real cyberspace to the full extent of the term, and actually it's a series of cyberspaces. The problem is that when you get 2 billion people, and then 3 and 4 and 5, you get people with very naturally and very legitimate different frameworks in terms of culture, religion, politics, and so on. And so the rules of coexistence on this common space or in those common spaces become harder to define. And the irony is that the more the internet grows, the more it is successful, the more we need common rules of behavior, and the harder it is to find common rules. The interesting thing about the internet is that it has encountered this success because of a particular nature, the so-called layered structure of the internet that distinguishes, without getting into details, the infrastructure layer, the applications layer, the content layers, and so on. And this separation is probably one of the strongest elements that determine the success of the internet. So As we're moving to an internet that has 2 billion, 3 billion, and so on, we have a need for governance, internet governance, and we'll talk about that a little bit later. For those of you who followed the process of the World Summit of the Information Society, the WSIS, you may know that there is a definition of internet governance. And without explaining it in full detail, this definition says that it is the elaboration and the implementation of shared regimes that shape the evolution and the use of the internet. And the elaboration and implementation of those rules by government, civil society, the private sector, and international organizations in their respective roles. This is the so-called multi-stakeholder model. This is all well and nice until we get to the second question, which is, how does that fit with the traditional international system that we have? Let's remember that the international system is based and functions to a very large extent on geographically bounded jurisdictions. National governments have sovereignty over those jurisdictions, and millions, literally millions of people, if not hundreds of millions of people in history, have actually lost their lives to define very precisely where those boundaries and those frontiers take place. The problem is that this is perfectly fine, and it works very well if I want to handle the interaction between a French guy insulting another French guy on a French online platform. If, however, and no offense to the countries that I will mention, if I'm from Australia, I'm traveling in Brazil, and I actually post something that is defamatory against somebody in England through a Twitter platform, what is the jurisdiction? And the problem that we're facing is that, unfortunately, what used to be exceptions is becoming the norm. And so we have an international system that is fundamentally very, very, very adapted to a world where people have mostly interactions in their own national territories and relatively rare interactions cross-border. Problem is, the internet is technically cross-border. It is even more. It is technically borderless, or it has been conceived as being technically borderless. And so what we're witnessing today is a tension between this borderless nature of the internet, which actually is a condition of its success and its power and its benefits, and the physically bounded international legal architecture that is relying very legitimately on nation states and the legislative process, or on treaty making among the different governments. And the reason why the exception is not the exception anymore, I don't have to get into detail. It's about speed, it's about the number of people, it's about the amount of data that is exchanged, and it is about the type of treatment that we can do by crossing the information that is available. And so the problem that we have is, at the moment, every single country, very legitimately, is struggling to define the rules at the national level, with the very big problem of where to put the cursor in all places. And you can notice that in most countries, the question of where to put the cursor is emerging one way or the other. But the problem is that they're all trying to do that on a separate basis, each on their own, which leads to potential conflicts of jurisdiction, question of attribution of jurisdiction, or incompatibility of the different norms. And the challenge is that the main solution that we seem to be heading towards, or the sort of moving backwards that we are witnessing at the moment, which is reestablishing borders on the internet, has a certain number of potentially very troublesome unintended consequences. I take only one: geo-IP filtering. Without getting into the technical, it means that if you are in France, you're not supposed to see, for instance, content that is coming from the United States, where if it's a movie or anything else, doesn't have the right to be broadcasted or visible in this country. So fundamentally, platforms are agreeing, in many cases, to do what is called geo-IP filtering, like depending on where you are, content is accessible or not. This has the danger of going, boom, of going towards a potential re-establishment of national boundaries and potentially surveillance. The point I want to make is, and this is the purpose of the program that I'm developing at the International Diplomatic Academy, this tension cannot be resolved without the different actors discussing together because of, one, what I call the fractalization of sovereignty, the fact that, for instance, the legislation of one country can actually expand and become applicable in other countries. And second, the fact that, as was mentioned before, very large platforms, such as Facebook or YouTube or Twitter or others, are becoming digital territories on their own. And so my question, which was the third question, which I'll be happy to discuss further with those who are interested, is how are we witnessing a new geography of cyberspace, new territories that will be part of an expanded notion of jurisdiction that will allow, for instance, the terms of service of those companies to provide solutions like alternative dispute resolutions or frameworks at the first level to solve problems. Thanks for the opportunity to present this. I'll be happy to provide any information for those who are interested. And welcome to the great debate of what is the geography of cyberspace. Thank you.
Those were certainly challenging questions, and thank you for bringing them forward, Bertrand. I can take one or two questions directly for Bertrand, then we're going to go to a panel that includes Bertrand, and we'll be taking more questions. So right now, does one of you have a burning question to direct at Bertrand? There we go, right here.
Thank you for your presentation. I'm very concerned in new geography of internet. How do you view ACTA that has been signed recently by a number of co-sponsors of the legislation, and yet we find out that no one knows really what the true letter and spirit of this act is. We learned that it was all done in secrecy, and it is supposed to provide protection of copyrights and stuff like that, and patents. Thank you.
Thank you for the question. Very quickly, I've mentioned one type of tool that we are trying to use, which is a national legislation. The other natural tool in the international so-called Westphalian order is international treaty making. The principle of treaty making is that the representatives of the governments alone are drafting treaties. Having been, as was mentioned, for 4 years, the French diplomatic ambassador for those issues, I know how those processes function. The bottom line is, and what is happening with ACTA is an exemplary illustration of this, is that there is no way that we can continue to produce international treaties on internet in the same way we were doing it in the past. For two reasons. Why? One, it is inefficient, and the second reason is that it is borderline illegitimate.
One more question. Okay. Here we go. Have a mic at the front here, please. Right here. Raise your hand again, sir. Thank you.
Hi, Alex Hoslett. With so many of Internet's major players being headquartered in the United States, with legislation like SOPA potentially restricting their freedoms, what can ICANN do on a global stage to ensure that the Internet remains democratic?
Well, I would address two elements. Regarding ICANN in itself, there is an element that people don't necessarily understand, which is that ICANN has a limited mandate. And one of the difficulties is that because it's one of the only visible and existing entity there, when there's a problem, there's a natural tendency to turn towards ICANN and to say, but what are you doing? Why don't you do more or so? It's very important that in any international regime related to the internet, and what ICANN does is basically managing a regime regarding the domain name space, is that each regime is sufficiently bounded and that people do not necessarily overlap, that they cooperate, but they don't overlap. So in that respect, the activities of ICANN are limited. And one connection to what I was explaining is that if you look at the geography of cyberspace, there's a very interesting question, which is if you think that as long as you're on Facebook.com, you're actually under the law of Facebook for a certain part in terms of freedom of expression, privacy, and so on, is the domain name space an element related to the map of cyberspace? But the second element that I would like to address briefly is the question of the location of a certain number of actors is leading in particular to what I call the fractalization of sovereignty, i.e., for those of you who are familiar with a case called Hoja Directa, and I can explain separately because it would be too long, it basically seems to imply that any website that is hosted under a .com, .org, or .net domain actually should be compliant with the American law and subject to potential seizure if there is a problem. Because the registries are based in the US and because the registrars, in many cases, are based in the US. So the question of the extension of national sovereignty on other territories, and it's not because it's a mean intention at all, it's just the natural application of sovereignty over an entity that is based on your territory, but that has an extraterritorial impact. And so the extraterritorial impact of national legislation is a very, very important element that we're trying to explore.